Thank you. It's good to applause because then the air gets to move and we wake ourselves up, which is good. Thank you very much, David, for your invitation. It's really great to be here. And thank you for enduring the afternoon and staying here with me until now, which is good. I'd like to thank also for the brilliant and really inspiring lectures before by Jeroen and André and also like Nicholas' diagrams. So it's really a pleasure to be here. What I bring to you is not necessarily a paper. It's more like, I felt like it's kind of a diagram. And when David invited me to talk here, I was thinking about the question that the conference puts for us, which is, are you alive or not, right? Which is a question that, in a way, made me think about an essay that I really, really, really like from 1934 by Roger Kaïwa. Roger Kaïwa is one of those good members of the Surrealist movement. He was a good member because he split at the age of 21, so he left quickly from this kind of cohort of boys in Paris. But before he did that, he wrote this incredible essay on animal mimicry. I don't know if you guys have read it, this essay, or ever run into it. Kaïwa was someone who was, throughout his life, was interested in two things, insects and rocks, pebbles. And the insect that he really loved to write about and to consider and to ponder was the praying mantis, right? You know the praying mantis that is praying like this? The female cuts the head of the male keeps copulating, right? This kind of thing. So he was really interested in this kind of animality, let's say. But he was also interested in rocks. And because of that, he was also interested in animals through which you could not distinguish anymore whether they were alive or dead, whether they belonged to the realm of the organic or the inorganic. And therefore, this question of are you alive or not was something that was essential for Roger Kaïwa. Now, in this essay on legendary psychasthenia, one of the things that he does, like he starts talking about animals, right? And he says, well, you know, what happens, there's a funny thing that happens with these animals that imitate nature, right? That use mimicry in order to disappear, right? Like the stick bug, you know about this, like the butterfly that disappears against the wall, all of this. He says, well, if there's a Darwinian explanation, a kind of rational explanation around these animals, which is they imitate space in order not to be devoured by the predators. But if you open the bellies of predators, you're going to find them there. They're eaten nevertheless. So there must be another explanation, right? And the other explanation that Kaïwa proposed was what he called a kind of luxury for space. It's as if organic matter or organisms or animals had this drive to become space, to become just like space, right? So the question is not a question of survival, it is a question of eros towards the immaterial, right? Which is a beautiful thing. So there's that going on. And then there's a moment towards the end of the essay that he starts talking about what he calls legendary psychasthenia, which is basically like somewhere between catatonic schizophrenia and heavy depression, right? Which is usually the state that we oscillate. I mean, I oscillate between one and the other in my daily life. But anyway, so a kind of catatonic schizophrenia and heavy depression, right? In which the subject becomes still, right? And then he says, there's a kind of inner darkness that comes into this subject in which the question for the schizophrenic and for the catatonic is that I don't know exactly where it is that I am, right? I don't know exactly where it is that I am, which is again like this question of indetermination, right? And then Kaïwa goes on to say, this is exactly what happens when we are in the dark, right? You shut down the lights, right? You are in absolute darkness. And what happens is that all of a sudden you cannot tell exactly where the limits of your body is, right? And also where is it that the limit of the outside world might be, right? So in the dark, in absolute darkness, you fall into a kind of vertigo, right? In which you enter into this becoming space, right? That only darkness can actually provide you. So and in that space, again, the question is whether you are alive or not. And therefore, like Kaïwa would say, therefore there is we may explain here a kind of fear of darkness, because the fear of darkness will be something that will take you into the experience of a life form or a mode of living away from being a person. Like he calls about a depersonalization. But what was amazing for Kaïwa is that he didn't see this as a kind of pathology or something that you should avoid, but actually something that perhaps you should experiment with. What would happen then if life would flow into a kind of darkness that, other than create a kind of state of fear, would bring to your life a different modality of really entering to this kind of vibrational existence with the outside and the inside, in which no boundary would stay put, right? So, the question of the conference prompted me to think about this essay by Roger Kaïwa. And then obviously, like, I have to start thinking about two other authors. And then I realized that the authors are Roger Kaïwa, okay? The other one is Fred Moten. I'll explain who he is in a moment. And the other one is Jonathan Crary. Maybe Jonathan Crary is more familiar to you in the visual arts, and because he has this incredible book called Techniques of the Observer, and a very recent book called 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, which is a book that everyone should buy immediately or download from somewhere and start reading right now. But anyway, I was thinking, like, this Jonathan Crary, this Fred Moten, the Roger Kaïwa, and then all of us this afternoon. This is kind of a boy fest in a way. It's like it's a little bit uncomfortable. And then I was thinking, like, at least we have Andrea Borgic and also Matt Ingvartsen to remind us also of this kind of theoretical, aesthetical investment on darkness. And Andre, is that you? Yeah, right before, very elegantly made this gesture towards my intervention here about darkness, and invoking a quote by Mette Ingvartsen in which she talks about, like, why don't we turn off the light in order to do something away from representation, away from signification and subjectivation, right? So exactly, in a way, a kind of Roger Kaïwa gesture that appears there. So, and I was thinking that, in Andrea's project, at least in the website where the project is, the cosmological project is explained, she has this beautiful sentence, when day for night is described as being a temporarily disrupting the coming of the light. And I was thinking about, whether this temporary disruption of the coming of the light would be something that would reconfigure something that Jeroen Peters said about the crocodile, but maybe in a different way, which is the dark promise. Could we think about a positive dark promise by temporarily disrupting the coming of the light? Okay, so in what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes, 40 minutes, something like that, is so that you understand, it's not an analysis of work. It's something that I've been more and more thinking as being a kind of co-imaginative effort. So co-imagining alongside with the artists and these authors, other possibilities for discourse and also other possibilities for life. And in a way, like, it goes back again to Roger Kaïwa, who throughout his career was invested in something that he called a general phenomenology of imagination. Right? He was interested not in phenomenology of objects and experience, but is it possible to think phenomenologically about imaginations, and which is something that he was very interested in. And in a way, like, I feel like the work of perhaps of discourse, in order perhaps to escape the analytical drive of enlightenment in its relationship to knowledge, is not actually to know or to describe the meaning of a work, but actually perhaps to co-imagine with the authors. So this is what I'm going to be doing, okay? And maybe to start, why the dark, or why darkness? It has to do with all of a sudden you start seeing that there's a kind of tendency in performance art, and mostly in choreography and dance and works that I am more attracted to somehow, Works by Manuel Pelmos, Esther Solomon, Xavier Leroy, Tino Segal, Metin Gvartsen, Marcelo Evelyn, and many, many, many others. In somewhere between the early 2000s until more or less now, but with a kind of peaking over the past maybe 4 or 5 years. Works in which total darkness or an activation of shadows is very, very important for that work, right? And in terms of the conversation that André was bringing before, like this kind of notion that performance requires the visible presence of both the performer and the audience, it seemed once again that some of these works were operating under a kind of different logic, right? In which dance and choreography gives nothing to view, but by giving nothing to view, it actually reveals something else, right? And for my generation, not for your generation, but when I was, I don't know, maybe in my 20s in Portugal, I had the dream of being a photographer. And I took like this photography class. And of course, in Portuguese, to develop a film is to reveal, right? You revelar, you reveal a film. And you reveal in the dark. You go into the dark room, right? You don't have that anymore. But you go into the dark room and you develop the film. You reveal it, right? So I was thinking about like these procedures in the dark that they give nothing to view but reveal a lot. And perhaps like this is how I understand a little bit, I'd like to think or co-imagine diagrammatically with these authors, like what's going on by this temporarily disruption of the coming of light in performance and choreography. That made me think about two things, and I'll read you a quote by Jonathan Crary, the author that I mentioned before, in the book 24/7, the one that you need to buy right away. And I don't get any fees for that, but it's okay. On page 19, it says something like this: "A 24/7 world is a disenchanted one in its eradication of shadows and obscurity and of alternate temporalities. It is a world identical to itself, a world with the shallowest of pasts, and thus in principle without specters. But the homogeneity of the present is an effect of the fraudulent brightness, okay, fraudulent brightness, that presumes to extend everywhere and to preempt any mystery or unknowability." Right? So basically, the whole project of the book, Jonathan Crary's book, is to say that we are living in a condition of what he calls permanent illumination, right? So the function of capital at this point is to capture photons, right? And to put photons into operation in screens and projections, and now we have the iPhone watch or whatever that is. Like, so we become like subservience to the photon, because the photon is that which does two things. First, keeps us awake as much as possible. And one of the recent phenomena that Netflix has been producing, I don't know if you have Netflix in Holland, but Netflix is like this, you know what it is, right? Right. So Netflix, it's producing this kind of what is called binging watching, right? So you watch TV, like you watch this series, like, you know, I watched 6 episodes of you know, House of Cards in one night. It's like at the end, you're like completely like this, right? But by doing that, you become subservient to this kind of photonic beams that turn you constantly into a consumer of these goods that are also made for more photons to circulate. And those photons circulate through, by you paying Netflix through credit cards, that goes also through this fiber optics network across the planet. And therefore, there's a kind of mobilization of light for capital, right? So that capital actually can function at the speed of light, right? So this is the kind of state of permanent illumination that Jonathan Crary is trying to analyze in this book. And in a way, he says, you know, in a way, like, I'm not talking about like against the eye or against visibility, but I'm just trying to remind you all that by giving so much light to the eye actually starts to function, is captured to a different kind of regime of visibility in which all of a sudden what matters to be seen is no longer there, right? And one of the things is this notion of disenchantment of the world, right? It's a world that is made of pure instrumentalization of subjectivity and affect, right? In order to serve the photological, right? So one of the things that I'd like to maybe to bring to us is this notion that Derrida was invoked here today, and it was great. Seems to be disappearing from discourse, and it's always good to have Derrida back, right? Particularly in regards of what he calls his critique of photology. In his early writings, specifically of grammatology, and then on his essay on Nietzsche, Derrida mentions and emphasizes that the whole project of Western philosophy is what he calls a photology, right? It's like a logic of light, right? And perhaps more than a photology is a photophiliac project. It's a project that loves light, loves being in the light, right? Just like a narcissistic dancer loves to be in the spotlight, right? So in thinking about this photologics, I was thinking about, what is the political project then that the photologics or this kind of photophilia in Western philosophy produces. And there's a moment in the Dialectics of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer where they say something really interesting right in the beginning. It's in the preface of 1944, 1947. They say, or they write, "We have no doubt that freedom in society is inseparable from Enlightenment thinking." Right? So I was thinking about that, and then of course it has to do with a kind of understanding of National Socialism as kind of dark age, right? A kind of moment in which a kind of darkness falls into the project of Enlightenment. But on the other hand, we could also think about that perhaps National Socialism is actually a kind of photological endeavor as well, in which it's the higher rationality of National Socialism horror that implements actually a kind of absolute enlightenment in a way. So this would be a more polemic way of putting it. But so in thinking about this notion of the notion of freedom, it's inseparable from enlightenment, I was thinking like what happens actually in performances of everyday life in which actually dark rooms are created for us to experience freedom, right? It seems that at least there is a very different understanding or experience of society and sociability today, in which you can even think about, bars in which we have the dark rooms, in which people will perform all sorts of erotic experimentations, but also like to think about how the zones of obscurity are precisely the zones through which one can escape the 24/7 surveillance of the society of control, right? So it seems that the corner, the obscure, the occult is something that perhaps could reveal to us another possibility of socialization in which actually what you find is freedom, right? So the problem is for those of us who that work with visibility, like visual artists, it's called visual arts, right? Or choreography, in which dance is supposed to be given itself to view for audiences. Like, how do we deal with perhaps a moment in time in which darkness is a promise of freedom, right? Now, and if it is a promise for freedom, what kind of philosophy, of kind of discourse can erupt, which has nothing to do with enlightenment, right, but with something else? And this is where I'd like to bring the thought and the philosophy and the kind of poetry of Fred Moten. Fred Moten perhaps is becoming a little bit more well known in Europe right now because he co-wrote a book with Stefano Harney that came out a couple of years ago, and the book is called The Undercommons, Black Study and Fugitive Thought, right? And actually, I think last year, it was 2014, maybe, in Gießen, there was this conference. Was it last year? Gießen, do you guys know about this? A conference that Bojana Kunst and Bojana Svej also co-organized called The Undercommons. So it came out of this thought by Fred Moten. And Fred is quite interesting because he's thinking about the notion the relationship between blackness, fugitivity, and thingliness, right? And he has this very direct relationship between the notions of darkness as the absence of light, with notions of blackness as schemas of racialization, and the history of slavery in the West, which is like the primary technology for precisely both the philosophical project of enlightenment and the colonial capitalist project of ongoing industrial globalization, right? The basis of all of this is this kind of black technology called the slave, right? That was produced, the primary accumulation that unleashed the conditions that we are right now, right? And in that sense, like what Fred is trying to do by thinking through jazz, particularly, but also thinking about what he calls the black radical performance in the US, he's trying to think about like how is it that, you know, the dark promise, it's actually a black aesthetics, right? In which precisely a different kind of sociability will come into the world by creating something completely away from the fraudulent brightness that the 24/7 state of permanent illumination brings us to. So this is like the kind of constellation through which I think like perhaps you can start thinking about how aesthetics, right, could, or art practices could start running away from this kind of photological imperatives, right? Okay. So one quick example just to think about the speed of light as something that perhaps we need to think a little bit more further about is, I don't know if there are any people coming here from the US, but last year there was like this ongoing question about scarcity and how the United States infrastructure is collapsing, right? And there was this moment in which a bridge between Manhattan and New Jersey was promised, and by the governor of New Jersey, and then he said, okay, let's build a new bridge between Manhattan and New Jersey because there's too much traffic, blah, 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 so we're going to do that, it's going to be great. So that was an electoral promise by the governor of New Jersey. And then when he was elected, of course, the bridge was scrapped. There's no money for the bridge. It was like $3 billion or something like that to build the bridge. But at the same time that the bridge was never built, another thing was built, I don't know if you know about that, which is the most perfect straight line on the planet ever made by human hands. Do you know about this? It's a tunnel. It's a tunnel that links downtown Manhattan to downtown Chicago. It's the most perfect straight line ever built by human hands. And in that straight line, it cost also $4 billion. And in that straight line, the purpose of the straight line is actually to put an absolutely perfectly fiber optic cable, right, that would have absolutely no deviation between certain banks in downtown Manhattan, speculative banks, and banks in downtown Chicago, so that the photon would not be deviated at all by microseconds, so that the information would go fast between Manhattan and Chicago, and an operation then you can advance, you can go like a little bit more ahead than everyone else behind you, right? So to see like this harnessing of the photon, I think it's one of the examples for the sake of capital, right? In which like actually the social common, which would be like, you know, let's build a little bit of a better life for everyone who's in this city clogged with traffic and pollution, is actually amazing, like to think about these priorities, right? So again, like how to think about this intricate relationship, and just to perhaps indicate a little bit more forcefully that these are really not metaphors, you know, that it is really about harnessing the photological and the photon, right? Okay, so when Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about, you know, that the project of enlightenment, it is important for the project of enlightenment to create an operation of what they call the disenchantment of the world. This, in a way, was seen as a kind of positive thing, because going away from a kind of occult understanding of reality, you know, like then you all of a sudden you can have like kind of scientific understanding of things, so on and so forth. But I'm wondering like whether in a moment of affect theory and thinking about affects in performance and in relationality, we can start thinking about the implementation of an enchanted world, of a kind of re-enchantment of the world, and what would happen in this operation. Right? And in a way, like when I see a project like Andrea's project, which is this kind of cosmological project, a cynical way would be to say, oh, here we have the artist putting a signature to an event, right, which is completely exterior to this artist. So it would be like kind of megalomaniac gesture. But the other way would be to think about, you know, how is it that by indicating the existence of this event, right, we're actually bringing into our lives a kind of re-enchantment of the world, of the cosmos, right? And in a way, like by doing that gesture, I feel like there's a kind of already a way of escaping the fraudulent brightness that that Jonathan Crary talks about. So, you know, the other thing that I mentioned is how, and I think this relates a lot to the piece we saw, some of us saw before, the reenactment of the Robert Morris 1961 piece for the column, right? Because I feel like to be in the dark, right? One of the things that happens, and Kaïwa insists on this, is the notion of an active and necessary depersonalization of the human, right? And there's another book for the Boy Fest in this afternoon by Roberto Esposito, who's an Italian philosopher coming a little bit from the line of George Agamben. There's a book that he published not too long ago that in English has been translated as The Third Person. And in the third person, what Esposito tries to do is to think about how is it possible for us to conceive modes of life that flow away from the dispositive person that he talks about? And what is the dispositive person? The dispositive person is that which neoliberal capital and enlightenment democracy offers to the human matter, or to the human flesh, in order to be able to exist in the world, right? And what are the main traits of a person? First of all, the person must be recognized as having a face, right? And the second thing, has to be recognized as having a specific gender, age, racial group, a specific disposition within the nation state, right? And also to be able to produce for him or herself a personal narrative. Like you have to have your biography, right? So the question of the person is or the notion of the person is very much associated to the notion of private property, right? The person is the one who has agency over his or her destiny as owner of his or her destiny, right? Now, what becomes a little bit complicated right now is that actually the notion of the person has become a very contentious figure, because two things are happening, at least in the United States, which is the place of crazy experimentation on microfascisms. It's under the guise of liberties, which is to think about, you know, this kind of perverse moment in which corporations actually act as persons, right? So a corporation actually is a person. It has the same legal rights as a person, and therefore can enter into society as a kind of person, right? And on the other hand, like you have like this ongoing debate from the right wing, which is to say, we have to recognize like even like the most minute cellular segmentation in the uterus as being a person, right? It's not even an embryo, it's already a person, right? So this expansion of the notion of the person is precisely the way through which the state captures life, right? To introduce it into this kind of modality of absolute conformity to a mode of being in the world that can be captured constantly, right? So Esposito is thinking about and interested in thinking about philosophies and artistic practices that lead you away or to at least allow you to think about life away from what he calls the dispositive person, right? You know, is it possible for us to live away from this? And in a way, and therefore it has to do it away from personality, right? And once we live like in a moment that the book of faces is that which constitutes what they call social networks, which is a kind of a horrible thing, like Facebook, the book of faces, right? In which, again, like the institution of personhood is very much reinforced. You have to have a name, you have to describe your relationship, and you have, so this kind of formatings of personhoods, it seems to me that something needs to be done there in terms of personality. And that's why like the performances of 1961, like the column and other kinds of performances in which things enter into conversation as opposed to, let's say, flashy bodies, participate somehow in my diagrammatic proposition, participate also of the same kind of black movement, if you want, of the same kind of dark movement. Because by introducing these things, right, the movement of depersonalization is already a kind of escape from the capture of this kind of light that brings him to a dispositive of being in the world. And this is really, for choreography, is quite interesting because we can think about how the birth of modern dance is an electric birth. We see like Mallarmé's attraction to Loy Fuller precisely as a kind of emblem of this kind of electric dancer, someone who can be captured and used actually light design in order for her to dance and to confuse her body also with this kind of photonic body. But also Mallarmé saying, you know, when you go into the theater, the most important element is not the dancer, it's not the audience, it's the chandelier, right? The lustre. Right? So why? Because it actually brings something into view, and after that, then you can experience, you know, everything. It's kind of secondary, somehow. So we have a little bit of time, and for the sake of clarity, I think that now, if you don't mind, I'll just read something, and so that it doesn't become too much of a delirium. And then after reading that, which is going to take maybe 5 minutes, maybe you can open up for a conversation, if that's okay. Is that okay? Okay. Good. I guess your silence means that you say yes. Okay. So, yeah. The question for choreography then would be, how does one create choreographically a dark or indiscrete zone between the non-instrumental thing and the non-person, between dark speculation and the possibility of an experience that matters and reassembles the photosphere otherwise? How does one activate, choreograph, dance, what Brian Masumi has called the vague potentialities continuum of variation, whose other name is intensification of non-identitary modes in the dark? Indeed, the dark or darkness is what appears in some recent choreographic propositions. After the series of work in 2000 where we see like trash, junk, and commodities, like what you start to see exactly are pieces in which one dances in the dark. But then like in the dark, perhaps, what could be happening is not only the notion of legendary psychasthenia that Kaïwa is talking about, but also perhaps what Marcel Duchamp, towards the end or at the moment in which he's stopping to make objects, called the making dissolution. And the making dissolution that was associated to his notion of inframance, or the infra-thin. And indeed, it seems that at least in Mette Ingvartsen's evaporated landscapes, we saw images in André's presentation, the operation of evaporating a landscape is already indicative of what's at stake in making dissolutions in the dark. Because in making dissolutions in the dark, we are looking for the infra or interstitial space where matter and affect commingle through a dark promise. The question is where the choreographer is having the evaporation taking place, right? So where is it that the evaporation taking place? Is the evaporation taking place in the objects that are brought into the stage, right? So what I think is interesting is that by putting us all in the dark, complete pitch darkness, which is actually almost impossible in a theatrical situation because safety must be above all respected, right? So it's a very, very, very hard thing to experience in theater production. I'm not even sure that it will be allowed today. Don't want to reveal too much, but perhaps we'll see, right? So it's not just a question of evaporating the object, right? But it's a question of evaporating the audience as well, right? And this is why it's not enough to put elements that we can see them bubbling around and all of this, but it's important that at a certain point we don't see anything and we just evaporate in this kind of operation, Kaïwa operation of luxury for space, like this becoming space, right? So it's not only, in the objects that, for instance, Ingvartsen activates in evaporated landscapes and artificial nature as well, but also to consider about that the infrathin element appears emphatically as a kind of dark operation, right? And therefore the insistence to be in absolute darkness. So, but there's something else that also happens in the dark, right? When you are in the dark, right, and you've been dissolved completely, right, and you're about to fall into a kind of vertigo or fear or panic, right, what possibly reemerges is a desire to language, right? And I was thinking about how the relationship that we'll see perhaps emerging in many of these pieces that happen in the dark between darkness and speculation. So, yeah. So what happens in the turbulent space of darkness and speculation would be like a speculation away from the normal or the usual understanding that we have, like a speculation, speculum. We go back to reflection, right? But you guys are visual artists. You also know that there's always been this kind of minor or neglected or abjected technology for making drawings and paintings, which is the Black Mirror, right? There's a beautiful book about the history of the Black Mirror that talks precisely about this kind of abjection of the Black Mirror, which is a black surface that nevertheless reflects, right? So I was thinking about, the notion of how is it that in the dark we dissolve, we depersonalize, we don't become the center of the attention, we escape photology and the photonic and the fraudulent brightness, and then we enter into this kind of notion of a speculation, but through a dark reflection or a dark mirroring, right? A dark illumination, right? In which, by giving nothing to see, it's precisely the moment in which something may erupt, right? Because in the end, it's not about the negation of vision, but rather to find in light itself its inner darkness. So this is the thing, like how is it that within the beam of light, there is darkness in it? Merleau-Ponty has this incredible sentence in Phenomenology of Perception when he says, we have to look for the darkness at the core of the glass of milk, right? So look at the glass of milk and you have to look at the inner darkness in it, which I think is fantastic. So it is precisely about finding in light its darkness, right? And what is it that this darkness operates? It operates fugitivity, right? It's the fugitive potential against entrapment of lives and desires and vision through this photological condition that above all creates, according to Jonathan Crary, an immense incapacitation of visual experience, right? And this is the last thing that I want to bring to the conversation, which is this. In the dark, what we can potentially share after nothing has been given to us, right, is to go out into the light, extract from it its darkness, right? But the darkness will also have to continue the notion of experiencing, right? So in other words, it seems to me there's a kind of speculative storytelling in the darks that reveals imagination as a collective fusing of bodies with space and time, which creates a totem transfusion, which is again this kind of making disillusion that darkness operates. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself because I wrote this very quickly, so it's very badly written. So in that sense, darkness becomes the revealing agent of how history, as experience, may acquire a kind of collective embodiment, which does not correspond to the cliches of communal life, but corresponds, and now I need to find the quote, to what Fred Moten calls the liberatory value of ensemblic depersonalization. So together we're not going to create a new person, collective person, we're going to collectively depersonalize, ensemblically, and share speculatively into the space of imagination. So it seems to me that by doing all of this, we escape also the kind of drive for the production of knowledge. And I'll just say this right now because we are here in the school and you're artists, and there's this whole thing about, you know, the question of artistic research and the question of creating, you know, what is the function of artists in the school. And it seems to me that we are again in a very different, very, very difficult and dangerous moment in which perhaps the photological imperative of capital and making us useful persons for society as artists would capture back into this notion of enlightenment. Like, you have to make work that is understandable or useful for society. You see what I'm saying? So that then you have to make art as knowledge, right? So as opposed to that, I was thinking about what happens if instead of knowledge, we have speculation as a paradigm for making art, like this kind of speculative impulse, right? This kind of experimental speculation. And that has been offered to us by all of these artists that I've been talking to you about, and by the dark reflection and all of this. And let me see if I have anything more interesting to be a final ending, but I don't think I do. So I finish here and I open for, I think we have 10 minutes for questions. So thanks.
André, thank you so much.
Yes.
For this brilliant provocation of a speculative presentation that you gave. I have a bit of a handicap here, which is that sadly, I have yet to read both Moten's and the latest Crary, although I know the latter more so than I do the former, at least in terms of content. So I guess before I go on to my question, I wanted to ask you to please repeat this quote of Moten about collectively depersonalizing, and then I will pursue with my...
But then it's actually a little bit unfair, but I'll to Moten and to you.
Oh,
but
okay.
I'll repeat it, and then I'll try to explain it as much as possible. Moten, the quote that I read says, the liberatory value of ensemblic depersonalization. And I can explain within his philosophy what that means.
Okay, because what I understand he's trying to communicating actually goes counter what I was going to propose. I have difficulties with the notion that a counter to photology would be a further disappearance and a further dematerialization through darkness. So that's one thing. And then I also have difficulty with the way in which blackness ideologically is being recuperated to further the enlightenment of the West. That seems politically ambivalent. The ways that, again, the experience of blackness is being exploited towards these ends. And I doubt that this is what Moten would suggest. Certainly not. So that's where I'm lacking knowledge, better knowledge of his book. And then there is, now third is more of a comment. I'm thinking about Darby English, how to look at a work of art in complete darkness. And of course of David Hammond's Concerto in Black and Blue, where instead of, well, first he plunges us into darkness, but so there be another light that emanates. So, mind you, in Concerto in Black and Blue, that light is also an artificial light. But again, I have difficulties with this notion of total darkness, particularly if it's related to an ideological blackness. And I would be instead looking at an other light, one which wouldn't be dependent on photons, but that be light nonetheless.
Okay. I think I'm going to have to repeat everything I just said, but first of all, just to thank you for your question, because it's important to clarify, to use the word that we use, right? To clarify. But away from a kind of obscure photology. So first of all, Fred Moten's project is definitely not the activation of darkness or blackness as something that will further the project of enlightenment. And actually, I think that's what I said, was precisely that blackness is that which perhaps would interrupt that project and relaunch it to a different articulation, completely different, right? It would be unfair for me to summarize the scope of Fred Moten's brilliant philosophical understanding of blackness, but he talks about, he has a book, he has an essay called The Case of Blackness. In that essay, he analyzes an incredible non-dialogue between Cecil Taylor and Reinhardt, right? So, yeah, so in that essay also, what Fred Moten is saying basically that he's interested in thinking about how is it that Victory Boogie Woogie, Mondrian's last painting, is, as according to Moten, is all blackness. Right? So how is it that something that is basically white, right? It's all blackness, right? And the reason that is because Fred is proposing kind of political ontology for blackness, right? In which blackness is not only a mode of experience, a particular subjection, an abjection within the regime of enlightenment, right? That creates an experience of resistance, but also of persistence, that is predicated on the ongoing cartography of the situation. So there's a profound activation of a certain kind of knowledge that is made for one to escape, right? To become fugitive. And then he talks about this notion of fugitivity, and he says, but fugitivity has to be so much activated that that fugitivity escapes even the fugitive, so that it's never identified, right? So in that sense, like, it seems to me that his entire project is an anti-enlightenment project, right? That is in dialogue with the fact that enlightenment is predicated on the profound racialization of blackness, and Kant is all about that, right? So I hope this answers one part of the question. And as you said, like, the question would be like, how is it that then we could also enter into I know it's a difficult proposition, like to propose darkness as blackness in the sense that Moten talks about, right? On the other hand, there's something about there's a power in darkness, right? Power in the dark. There was a song in the 70s of this, right? There's a power in darkness, right? That seems to be capturing a kind of contemporary imagination, right? Which tends to be an imagination of resistance, which tends to be allied to the notion of speculation, right? And it tends to be it's interesting how it coincides with a moment of hypervisibility in which our subjectivity is put into a position of hypervisibility. We have to be constantly scrutinized. I mean, in the US, you know, like the machines that you go through the airports that actually, they are X-ray machines, right? So your bones are scrutinized. So everything becomes transparent to the radiation, right? So at that moment, it seems to me that there's something interesting happening in these propositions, right? That would lead perhaps to a kind of, if you want to push, I would say, yeah, we are in the vault, right? There is a political unconscious perhaps bubbling up, maybe. Not to say it's the same experience, but to say what would happen in this kind of alliance, right? What would happen? And this is the moment in which Fred's philosophy becomes very criticized by many, because there is an ontological understanding of blackness. In Under Commons, it says blackness is an experience that transverses all sorts of races, identities, ages, nations, body types, so on and so forth, but to which people tend to have darker epidermia and are poor and have an experience of abjection, tend to have a relationship too, right? That's why Obama is not black, in a way, right? So I don't know if I answer all of your questions, which are the questions, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it
Thanks.
was also to do with dematerializing, but.
Well, yeah. Well, but then dematerialization, I'm all for that, because I work with dance, and I'm totally for the non-photological, the non-present, the remnants of memory. I'm completely Derridian. I love that kind of stuff. I believe in the storyteller, the one who, like, the dematerialization is precisely the condition of possibility for new materializations through the sharing of the experience, right? So that for me sounds, so that someone does a dance piece called Speculations in the dark, well, in the dark for someone, like, so yeah, well, it's been revealed, but so that's interesting. That's really interesting for me.
I'll pass the mic, we'll continue.
We maybe have time for one last question.
Briefly, you mentioned Brian Masumi, and
yes.
In the beginning of Parabolas to the Virtual, he makes a comment that the body functions as doing two things. It feels as it moves, and it moves as it feels. I was wondering if you are then saying that darkness is a catalyst to increasing this speculative threshold of this awareness of feeling.
Yeah, I am. And that's why it's interesting for me to think about why is it that, for instance, Hijikata, when he starts to develop Buto, it is important for him to call it a dance of darkness. Right? So where is it that we find this darkness, which is a different kind of racialization in its history, right? And a different kind of embodiment and understanding of movement, actually, comes precisely from at the moment in which the entire project of technological implementation falls into Japan, right? And therefore you need to start rethinking the human. That's the beginning of the kind of post-human thinking. Like, we're done with the notion of humanity, right? And Hijikata would say, I envy the rib cage of a dog. I like my rib cage, but I envy the rib cage of a dog. So the becoming animal, which is also, in order to do that, you have to go through a kind of condition of darkness that he calls, our bodies needs to be perceived as a kind of ash, right? And once we become ashes, then we can start moving and feeling in different ways. So, yeah. Is that okay? Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, André.